Greetings and welcome to 3dmotive.com. My name is Alan Thorne and I'll be your instructor on this comprehensive course introducing you to the Unity 5 game engine and its exciting feature set. In this module, we'll jump into the expansive world of animation and motion, breathing life and energy into your games. Here I'll start by showing you how to use the Unity animation window to build animations directly within the Unity editor. Then we'll examine the relationship between animations and game logic through events. And then we'll move on to optimal export-import workflows, seeing how we can transfer animation data from 3D software into Unity. Then we'll look at character animation using the Mecanim system, exploring issues such as root motion as well as animation blend and transitions using state machines. By the end of this part, you'll be well positioned for creating emotive animations that'll take your games to the next level. So let's get started. So in this part of the course, we're going to be considering animation in Unity 5, and this consists primarily in two parts. First, we're going to be building this scene that you can see here in front of you, in which we're going to make a button move and have a door open. And in the second part, we're going to be considering character animation. So here we have a glimpse of the future, because what I'm showing you here is a scene, a completed scene, and this is the scene that we are going to be making. You can find this scene in the course companion files in the door animation project. I've gone ahead and assembled this scene just by using the standard assets that come with Unity 5. You can import these into your project if you want to make it from scratch by choosing Assets, Import Package, and you can select both the Characters package for the first person controller and also the Prototyping package for these primitive assets that we can use to assemble a level. So we have this level here in front of us, which consists primarily of two islands that are connected together by this platform. And if I zoom in just a little bit further, you will see that this platform is divided by this door, which is closed here. So we have this archway and then we have this door section. And what we're going to be able to do is use the first person controller, which is located over here. We're going to be able to walk forwards and push this button. And when we push this button here, it's going to push inwards and then come back out again. Press Ctrl Z to undo that. And pushing this button triggers the door here to open so that we can pass through into this region of the level. So what we're going to be seeing here is primarily two different things. One, we're going to be seeing how we can make different things in the level interactable. That is how the player can push this button and how it will have an effect. And then secondly, we're going to be animating objects in the scene so that they move automatically. I'm going to give you a demonstration of this level by switching over here to the Game tab. I'm going to maximize the game view here and then just press play on the toolbar. And when I do that, you can see that I have first person controls and I can walk around the level. So we're going to have the ability to come over to this area here. And straight away that door is going to block me from passing through. I can't get to the other side, but I'm going to be able to approach this button and click on it with my mouse cursor. And when I do this, let me just get a better viewing angle. When I click on that button, it's going to move inwards and the door will open automatically. So let's just click on that switch and there you can see I press the button and the door opens. So let's just see that a second time. So I'm going to press play on the toolbar. Going to move over here and walk towards the button that we have. So I'm going to be able to click on the button here. The door opens and now I can just run through and reach the other side of the level. Now it's a pretty simple animation, but in order to achieve this, we're going to be using a wide range of animation features in Unity. We will be creating this entire animation from scratch using the Unity editor. We won't be using any external tools. So we'll get started at doing that next. So now we're going to get started with the animation project here in Unity, and you can see that I have open in front of me the door animation scene. This is the starting point of the scene, so all the animation data that we saw in the previous movie has been removed. We still have the button object and the door object, but they are no longer animated. This means that if I switch to the game tab, maximize the game view and press play, we can move the first person controller around. But if I approach the button object here, for example, and I click on the button, nothing happens, the button doesn't move, and the door doesn't open, and we can't pass through the door. It's a completely solid object. So I'm going to press stop on the toolbar here and just take a look at the scene that we have. So we just have this completely empty scene devoid of animation, and I'm using only the standard assets. But one thing I want to draw your attention to is I have modified the first person controller, and I want to show you how. It is simply for the purposes of this project. I'm going to scroll up here in the hierarchy panel and select the FPS controller. If I double click that, it is centered here in the viewport. If I select the first person controller component, you can see that for mouse look, X and Y sensitivity is highlighted in bold, which means that I have changed those settings from their defaults. I have set them both to 50, and the reason for that is I want the first person controller view to move more quickly so that the mouse cursor is generally centered at the center of the viewport here. This is going to be important because later when we're going to be programming the button functionality, the method that we're going to use relies on the fact that the cursor, the mouse cursor, actually is over the object that we click on. So I want to keep the mouse cursor at the center of the viewport here. I don't want it to go to the edges. We want to make sure that the cursor is at the center of the view so that we can properly detect when the mouse clicks on objects. So I'm going to stop level playback here, and we're going to get started at creating the animations that we need. So when we click on this button, the door will open. So the very first thing that I want to animate is this door object. So I'm going to click on that in the viewport here. Now you can see that we've got the door, and this is going to rotate open. But if you look at the pivot point of this door, the pivot point is down here at the center. This is the location of the door pivot. Now I can change the pivot by clicking up here on pivot to change it to the center of the object, but all that does is it moves the pivot point from down here at the center to the real center of the object, and that's not appropriate really, because when I want this door to open, I want it to rotate open. So I'm going to switch to the rotate tool, and if I rotate this door, you can see that right now it's rotating around its center. That is not what I want to happen. What I want to happen is for the door to rotate around its hinge, which will be over here. So I'm going to use a hierarchical relationship to achieve that. I'm going to create a completely new and empty game object that's going to act as the hinge for the door. So I'm going to choose game object, create empty, or press Ctrl-Shift-N on the keyboard. So I'm going to select that here, and by default it's called game object, but I'm going to rename this to door hinge and switch to the translate tool. So here is the empty game object, and it's almost really where I want it to be. I'm just going to reposition it maybe somewhere over here like this inside the door frame. So maybe somewhere around here like so. I'm going to just lower that down to the floor here, and maybe somewhere like this. So I'm going to have the door hinge about there, and then I'm going to parent the door to the hinge. So this is the door object here. I'm going to drag and drop that under the door hinge object, and now when I select the door hinge, if I switch to the rotate tool and I rotate the door, now it rotates properly as we need it to for an opening door. So that's basically the construction that we're going to be using for the door to create the door open animation. We'll get started at creating that animation next. Now the door has been created and set up properly so that it can rotate on its hinges, I now want to actually create the door animation itself, and to do that I'm going to be using the Unity Animation Editor. So let's get started with that. What I'm going to do first of all is make sure that I select the door hinge in the hierarchy panel. that is the object that I want to be animating. So I don't want to select the door object itself. We've seen that this rotates around its center, and I want to rotate around the hinge. So I'm going to select the door hinge object. The next thing I'm going to do is to display the Unity animation editor. And the way I can do that is by moving up here to the menu and choosing Window and then choosing Animation, or press Ctrl+6 on the keyboard. So Window, Animation. Be careful here, I am not selecting Animation Parameter and I am not selecting Animator. I'm selecting Animation, so that's Ctrl+6. When I select that, I will then get the animation window. This may appear completely free floating like this. Instead, I can just click and drag and dock that down the bottom here. I prefer to have a horizontal view of this window, but you can go ahead and choose any layout that you prefer. So I'm going to be animating this door hinge, so make sure that is selected. And then with the animation window active, I'm going to click on this button down here that says Add Property. This allows us to insert a property of this object that we want to animate. So I'm going to choose Add Property, and then it immediately asks me where I want to save the data here for this object. So I'm just going to select, for example, a name for this animation. So I'm just going to call this anim and door. So I'm going to choose anim door, and then I'm going to choose save, like so. And then it displays this dialog here asking me to select which component do I want to animate. Well, because I want to animate the rotation of a door, we can see that we have the rotation property here, and this is part of the transform component. So I'm going to expand the transform component, and here we have the choice. Do we want to animate position, rotation, or scale? I want to animate the rotation. So I'm going to click a plus on that property to insert the rotation channel into this timeline view. Now this timeline view charts time from time 0 here and to time 1, that is 1 second. But we do have the ability afterwards to speed up and slow down the animation to take more time or less time if we prefer. Now it inserts keyframes into the timeline. These are key points in the animation when we are defining the rotation of this object, and what Unity will do is between the two keyframes, Unity will blend the animation data to create motion. So right now, as I scrub this timeline between the start frame and the end frame, and I'm doing that just by moving up here to this timeline and clicking and dragging, and this red line, this tells us where we are in the animation. So if I click and drag over here, again the animation is changing, and you can see the frame is updating here. Now right now nothing is happening, and that is simply because the animation data for this door at the start keyframe and the end, it's identical. So at the start of the animation, the door should be closed as it is there now, but at the end of the animation, the door should be open. So I'm going to scrub the timeline here to the final keyframe, which is this one here, and to make the door open at that point, all I am going to do is just rotate the door open. And you can see that my animation data has been recorded simply because if you look here on the rotation area, these fields are now highlighted in red to indicate that they have been keyframed. And now if I scrub between the timeline here, you can see that the door is opening and closing. In fact, if I now switch to the game tab here, so if I now switch to the game tab and press play, actually if I switch to the scene tab and press play, if I switch back to the scene tab, you can see what's happening with that door animation. The door is now continually opening and closing. So that animation is playing automatically, and it's playing on a loop. The animation itself looks okay. I'm probably going to refine that a little bit more, and I'll show you how shortly. But certainly one thing that we don't want to happen is we don't want this animation to play when the level begins And also we don't want it to play on a loop like this, continually opening and closing. So these are things that we need to fix, and I'm going to be addressing those next. So now it's time for us to refine the door open animation that we have here. Right now the door is continually opening and closing. We're going to be addressing that shortly. But one of the things that I want to address directly to do with the animation itself is that the animation is reasonably sharp. That is, the door opens at a continual speed, the same speed throughout the entire animation. And I want a kind of ease in, ease out effect so that the door begins to open more slowly, speeds up, and then finally slows down at the end when it begins to open to its fullest extent. So I'm going to go back to the animation window here. So I'm going to select, make sure that the door hinge is selected in the level. Go back to the animation window so that I can see the animation data here in the timeline. And right now the animation changes from the first keyframe to the last. But we can get a more advanced view of the animation data in this editor by moving down here and switching from the dope sheet to the curve editor, so that when I select curves, we can get a different view on the animation data. Now if I expand the door rotation here, we get the X, Y and Z rotation. This door is rotating open on the Y axis. So when I select the Y axis, you can see the rotation of the door over time, and that rotation is completely linear. So here at time 0, the door is at this rotation, and then finally at the final keyframe, it's at this rotation. But what I want to do is to introduce ease in, ease out. I want to introduce a curve as opposed to a line, and we can do that quite easily by, for example, selecting the first keyframe by clicking on it. And then right-clicking, we can change the kind of keyframe this is. I'm going to change this to flat. And when I change it to flat, and I click on this little grey handle, the Bezier handle, we have control here over the shape of this curve. So I'm going to kind of pull out the handle like that. And now notice the door is going to begin a little more slowly, and then the steepness of the curve defines the increase in the speed here. I'm going to select the final keyframe and do the same thing. I'm going to right click and then choose flat again. And there we have now a curve for an ease in, ease out motion. So that now when I go back to the play button here and I take a look at the door in the scene tab, you can see that we get this ease in, ease out motion on the door. But notice that the door is still playing on this loop like this, and I don't want that either. So I'm going to stop playback and I'm going to return back here to the project panel. When we create the animation data, notice here that Unity has generated 2 new assets in the scene. It has created anim door, which contains all of the animation data itself. And we also have this other asset here with this icon, which is called an animation controller. And this tells Unity about how this particular door in the scene should play its animation. So the first thing that I want to control is the fact that this door should not play on a loop. It shouldn't keep on saying open, close, open, close, open, close, and so on. So I'm going to select the animation door object that I have created. I'm going to select that here in the project panel. And in the object inspector, you will see that we have loop time and there is a tick in that box. I'm going to take the tick out of that box, and this prevents the animation from playing on a loop. I can just click and drag the game tab here so that I can get a view of both views here. And if I keep my eye on the scene tab and press play, the door will open once, and now it will stay open. Now the animation does not play on a loop, it plays simply once. But the problem that we have is that it still plays at the very beginning of the level. It plays automatically. I don't want that to happen. Instead, I want the door to open when we press the button. And this is something we're going to be addressing shortly. Now, before working on the door even further, so that it opens only when we press the button, I'm actually going to change our attention here to the cylinder object and create the button animation using the tools that we have seen already. That is by using the animation editor. So I'm going to be creating the animation for this cylinder now, which is going to be the button move animation. It's still the case that if I go to the game tab and press play on the toolbar here, the door now has opened because it's played the animation, and it still remains open. That's still not what I want, but we will be fixing that shortly. So I'm going to press stop here and then go back here to the scene tab. I'm going to be focusing my attention on this button object now. So we're going to be animating that instead. Before going any further, I'm just going to grab in the project panel the anim door and the door hinge animation controller assets that Unity has generated. And for good organization practices, I'm going to be dragging and dropping those into the animations folder. That is absolutely fine. Unity doesn't mind it when you do that. It still knows that we've moved them to this folder now. It will not lose track of that data. By the way, if I select the door hinge in the level, if I select that object, if I just zoom in on the door, you will see that now this door hinge object has a new component, which is an animator component. And it is referencing this animation data that we have created. We will be revisiting this shortly. So I'm going to select the cylinder object in the scene here. I'm just going to bring back the game tab so that we can kind of get a full screen view of the scene tab here. So I'm going to be animating this cylinder, which is going to be the button animation. And effectively all this animation is going to do is the button, when pressed, is going to move in and then move out. So that's all this animation is. So I'm going to make sure that the cylinder object, which is the button, I'm going to make sure that is selected. And then I'm going to display the animation window. If you don't have that window visible to you, again, you can access it by choosing Window and then choosing Animation, or press Ctrl 6 on the keyboard. But I already have it here in the project panel, which is here under the animation section. So I'm going to select that, and straight away again we're going to have this animation editor. I'm going to choose Add Property, and again we get to pick what the animation is going to be called. I'm going to call this one anim and button, like so, and then press save in the dialog. And once again it asks me, what do I want to animate? This time, instead of animating the rotation, I want to animate the position of the object. But as before, this is still part of the transform component. So I'm going to expand the transform component. And for the position, I'm going to press on the plus icon. And once again, we get our two keyframes. Now, this animation is a little bit different than the door animation, because basically what is going to happen is this button is going to start and end in the same place. The button's going to push in and then come back out again to where it was before. This means that the start and the end keyframes should be identical. So that is how they are right now. The difference is that during the middle of the animation, the button will push inwards. So I'm going to slide the time slider here to the 30-second mark here. The halfway half a second mark, which is this point here, not 30 seconds. So I'm going to select this point, and I'm just going to move the button inwards into the object like this. And now if I slide the time slider, you can see that the button slides inwards and then it comes outwards again. I'm going to add a certain ease in motion to this animation as well. And to do that, I'm going to switch to the curves editor again. And I'm going to open up the position here for this object, and we can see that it doesn't really change the position on the x-axis, but it does indeed change the position on the z-axis. You can see that motion here. For the start and the end keyframes, I want the ease in, ease out effect that I created before. So I'm going to select the first keyframe, right click and choose flat. And again we get that ease in out effect. I'm going to select the last keyframe and again choose flat. And once again, you can see we get that motion. The motion beyond this time is simply loopable motion. So right now we've created the animation for this button. We can see that moving in and out here. I'm now going to switch back over to the project panel, and once again you can see that two objects have been created, the cylinder object and actually the cylinder object and the anim button object. So this object and this object have both been automatically generated inside the project panel here. If I select the anim button animation data, once again you can see we have this loop time, and it is enabled, meaning that the animation will play on a loop. But as before, I don't want this to play on a loop, so I'm going to remove the tick from that box. And if I make sure I just see the scene tab while the game is running and I press play on the toolbar, you'll see that the button moves in and then moves out. I'm going to play that again. Notice that it plays automatically. There the button pushes in and then comes back out again. So what we have here is a scenario in which the button is playing once, and that is how we want it to play. But like the door animation, it's playing when the level begins. We actually want these things to happen when this button is pushed. And interactivity is what I'm going to turn my attention to next. Now I'm going to be implementing object interactivity in Unity, and that simply means that we're coding the ability to be able to detect when objects are clicked on by our mouse and can respond to that appropriately. Now there are different ways we can approach this task in Unity. One way is by scripting, but another way is by using a newly added event system in Unity. So to get started at doing that, the very first thing that we need to add is an event system. To add that, I choose Game Object and UI, and then I can choose Event System, which is the bottom option. So I'm just going to select Event System. We just need to have one of these present in the level, and it is here now. You can see that we have these components. We don't need to do anything else with this object. It just needs to be present in the level so that we can detect when we click on things. The next thing I want to do is to select the first person controller, expand this object and select the object beneath, which is the first person character. When I select this object, you can see that it has a camera component. Now, when we select the camera component, we need to add a new component to this object. Specifically, I'm going to be selecting Component, Events, and choosing Physics Raycaster. I'm going to add that to the camera. This is important because we are going to be using the game camera to look around the world. And when we click on objects, Unity is going to be trying to identify the object that we are clicking on. And one of the ways it's going to do that is it's going to use the camera to try to identify which thing we are looking at the time we click our mouse. So when we click on this button object, we're going to be clicking the mouse and looking at the button at the same time. And by using this Physics Raycaster, Unity will be able to determine the object that we are trying to click on. So it's important to have the Physics Raycaster here attached to the same object as the game camera. The next thing we want to do is to identify the object that should be interactable. In this case, it is this button object here. So I'm going to select the button in the level. The next thing we want to make sure is that when we select this button, it must have a collider component. In this case, it has a capsule collider. But if this object did not have a collider component, then we would need to add one manually. We could do that easily by simply selecting the object and then choosing Component, Physics, and we can choose a collider to add. We could add a box collider, sphere, capsule, for example. It doesn't really matter which one we add. We add one that is going to best approximate the mesh we are using. The collider is necessary because without the collider, Unity will not detect any clicks on the object at all. So it has to have this collider component and it must be enabled. And you can see that it is enabled here. It has a tick inside that box. The next thing we want to do is to add an event trigger component to this selected object. I can do that by selecting Component and then choosing Event, and then I can choose Event Trigger. So I'm going to select Event Trigger, and that will add an event trigger component down here to the button object, that is the object that we want to click on. What I want to do now with this event trigger is effectively add a new event type. I want to do something when we click on the button. So I'm going to choose Add New Event Type. I'm going to select Add New Event Type, and then this context menu appears, giving us different events that we can detect. The event that I want to detect is pointer click. I want to detect when the mouse pointer clicks on the object. So I'm going to select pointer click, and this adds a new event here. Inside this region, we get to define what we want to happen when the click occurs. Now, right now, we want the button animation to play and the door to open. I'm going to be handling that shortly, but just to test this functionality, let's get it to do something different. So I'm going to click on this plus arrow here to add a new action that's going to happen when the button is clicked. So I'm going to click on the plus icon, and then we get to choose what we want to happen. Well, first of all, the thing that I want to happen, I want it to happen to this button object. I want this button to disappear when it's clicked. So I'm going to drag and drop the cylinder into this slot here to say that the thing that's going to happen, it's going to happen to the cylinder. And then in this area here, the drop down list that says no function, I'm going to click on that drop down and I get to choose what do I want to happen. And I'm simply going to choose game object, and then another menu appears. Let me just bring the Unity window into view here more. So I'm going to choose no function, and then I'm going to choose game object. And what I want to do is I want to change the active status of the object. Actually, I think that also appears outside the recording window. So let's try this again. I'm going to choose no function, then I'm going to choose game object, and I want to choose set active, which means we can choose whether the object is going to be activated or deactivated. Well, I'm going to choose set active, and if I put a tick in this box, that means that we want the game object to be visible, and if we take the tick out, it means that the game object will disappear. So I'm just going to expand the window back to the recording size here, and for test purposes, I'm going to just test out this game. I'm going to expand the game tab here, press play on the toolbar, and I'm going to walk over to the button object, which is over here, and I'm just going to click on it. And when I click on it, the button disappears. And that happens because we have that event trigger component that says when we click on the button, it should disappear. So this gives us an example about how we can detect when we click on an object and perform something in response. What we want to do next is for the button animation to play when we click on it. We don't want the button to disappear. Instead, we want the animation to play, and we'll get started with that next. We now have the ability to detect when the mouse clicks on the button, and we can perform an action in response. The action that we want to perform is we want the button animation to play and the door to open. Right now, these animations play at the very beginning, and we're finally going to address that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, for example, start with the door here. So I'm going to select the door in the level, and you will see that when I select the door, actually I'm going to select the door hinge. When I select the door hinge, we have this animator component, and under the controller section we have this door hinge controller. If I click on that controller once, it will select that asset for me here in the project panel. You can see that we have this door hinge asset in addition to the door animation that we created using the animation editor. The anim door asset actually contains all the keyframe data, but the door hinge is what attaches to this object and tells this object when it should play this animation data. So I'm going to select the object here and again select the door hinge. I'm going to double click on the animation controller. I can double click on it here, or I can double click on it here in the project panel. Either way will get you to the same place. So I'm going to double click on this, and this will display the Animator editor. You can see that here, Animator. You can also display this window manually by choosing Window and choosing Animator. This is part of the Mechanim animation system in Unity. There's a lot to consider with the animation system that is part of Mechanim. I'm only going to be considering the basics here, but what you see in front of you here is what is called a state machine. So I can hold down the middle mouse button and kind of scroll around this view and see the different things that we have. We have these different building blocks, but notice that this building block, I can select that just by clicking on it, and I can also drag it around. It doesn't really matter where I position this. Notice that this is called Anim Door, and this references the door animation here. So what this system is doing is it's referring to a direction. So entry point here, this is when the animation begins, when the level starts, and then there's this arrow connecting to the door animation. That is why the door animation plays when the level begins, because the level begins and then it leads into the door animation. So we're going to start changing this now. In fact, what I want to happen when the level begins is I want the door to just remain closed and do nothing until we tell it to do something. So I'm going to right click in this background here inside the Animator window. I'm going to right click and then I'm going to choose Create State, and then I'm going to choose Empty. So I'm going to select empty, and we get this new and completely empty state here. And I'm just going to give this the name of, well, I'm going to give it the name of doing nothing and press enter. We can call it anything we like, but it simply means that we're not doing anything. And I want to make this the default state instead of this one. This is the default state, and we know that because it's highlighted in orange. So I'm going to select this state here. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to choose Set Layer as Default State. So I'm going to select that, and now notice that the entry point connects to doing nothing. And in fact now if I press play on the toolbar here, and I switch back to the Scene tab, you see that the door is closed because the animation hasn't played back. So that is a good beginning. We've now configured this animation using this animator editor so that when the level begins, it runs into the doing nothing state as opposed to the anim door state. But of course right now this anim door state is completely isolated. It is not connected to this in any way, and wherever there is no connection, the door can never actually get to this state. It can only travel along connections. So we need to build a connection between doing nothing and the anim door state. And we're going to be seeing how to do that next. Now it's time to build a functional connection for the door between the doing nothing state and the opening door state. We want the ability to be able to open the door on demand. We want that animation to play back when we tell it to play back. And to do this, we're going to need to use parameters and transitions. So I'm going to move over here in the Animator window, and you see that we have two tabs. We have a Layers tab and a Parameters tab. I'm going to select the Parameters tab, and over here we have this plus icon. I'm going to choose the plus icon, and we have the option between float, int, bool, or trigger. I'm going to select trigger because I want to be able to tell the animation when it should trigger, that is, when it should start. So I'm going to select trigger and give this the name of open door. So for example, when I click on this circle icon, I want to be able to say, now you should play the door open animation. We're going to be, if you like, remote controlling this by using the cylinder button collider. We'll see how this works shortly. So I want to build a connection between the doing nothing state and the anim door state that depends on this control switch. So I'm going to right click on the doing nothing state, and from the context menu I'm going to select make transition. And when I do that, we get this arrow that follows our mouse cursor, and it's asking me to pick a new state that we should change to. So I'm going to click on the anim door state, and now a connection has been drawn between doing nothing and the anim door state. I can click on this connection, and what I can do is tell Unity when I want to change from the doing nothing state to the anim door state. Now there's this tick box that says has exit time. which means that Unity is going to play the doing nothing animation once and then move into the anim door state automatically. I don't want that, so I'm going to take the tick out of that box. But under conditions, here is where we want to specify the condition under which we are going to change from doing nothing to playing the door animation. So I'm going to click on the plus icon here, and we get to specify what is the condition. And right now in this drop down box we have just open door, and this matches the name of the parameter that we've created up here, so that I'm saying that when this parameter open door is activated, the door will open by playing the open animation. So let's take a look at how this works in practice. I'm going to, over here, I'm going to press the play button on the toolbar. And again, we have our game. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just move the animator at the side here so that I can kind of see that playing. And I'm going to start playing back the game here. Actually, I'm going to switch to the game tab so that I can see this door here. Now notice that the mechanism graph here is just repeating in this doing nothing state. But when I press on the open door animation, now the door opens because I've activated that open door switch and the animation data went into the anim door animation here. So we want to be able to control this open door switch by using the event trigger that we have seen before. This is how we're going to initiate the playback of the open door animation. We've set up this graph now to create the connection between the states, and I'm just going to stop playback here. So that is the door configured. We have now configured the graph for this door so that just by using this switch we can choose when the animation plays. We're going to be doing a similar thing for this button here, so that when we click on the button we're going to be activating another switch that plays the button animation. And we'll see how to do that next. Now I want to configure the mechanism graph just as we did for the door for the button control. So we're going to be doing a very similar thing here. I'm going to be dragging, just dropping the animator window here so that I can see it in full screen. I'm going to select the cylinder object. And we can see that when I select the cylinder object and I double click on the animator here in the object inspector, so we have the controller setting. I'm going to double click on the cylinder, and again we have a very similar graph. Notice that the button press animation begins because the level beginning because we have this entry point here and it connects to the anim button here. So again, I want to create a completely new and empty doing nothing state for this button, so that when the level begins, the button isn't doing anything. I'm going to right click here inside the animator graph and choose create state and then select empty. Again, I'm going to rename this state to doing nothing like so and press enter on the keyboard. I'm going to right click on this state and choose set as layer default state. This now becomes the default state. And once again, we want to have a control switch so that in the parameters we can choose when the button animation plays. So under the parameters tab, I'm going to click on the plus icon and set an event trigger here. So I'm going to choose trigger. I'm going to name this to be push button. Press enter on the keyboard. So this time we're going to have a transition between the doing nothing state and the anim button state. So I'm going to right click and choose make transition, and I'm going to move that to the anim button state like so. So the button is doing nothing and then we press the button. So I'm going to select that transition. Once again, I'm going to disable the has exit time like so. And for the conditions, I'm going to click on the plus icon, and we want to transition between doing nothing and the anim button when we activate the push button control switch. But of course, once we enter the button push state, we don't want the push animation to play on a loop, continually play in, play out. We kind of want the button to come back to its original doing nothing state, so that if we wanted to, we could press the button a second time. So I'm going to select the anim button state, right click, choose make transition, and then I'm going to create a transition that leads back to the doing nothing state, so that we have this loop logic going on here. We have the ability to press the button. Once it's finished playing, it goes back to the doing nothing state, and we could, if we wanted, press the button a second time. So we have that repeating logic going on there as well. And if I were to press the play button on the toolbar and drag the animator in here, you can see that if I then press the push button switch, the button is pushed in, and then we go back to the do nothing state. I could activate this again to press the button a second time, and then I could do that again to press it a third time. So now we have configured the graph for both the button and the door. It's now time to return to the cylinder and its event trigger component to basically have the door open and the button animation play when we click on the button. And I'll be considering how to do that next. So now we have configured both the mechanism graph for the door and the button here, so that both of these will play as we need them to by activating the event triggers. But I'm going to select this button object here, and down here in the event trigger component we still have the old data that we defined, so that when we click on the button, what in fact happens is the button disappears. We no longer want to do that. So for this pointer click event, you can see we have this data here defining what happens. I'm going to just click once on this event data. It is highlighted in blue, and I'm going to select the minus button to remove that. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to be defining the behavior for the button and the door. So I'm going to press the plus icon here, and the first action that I want to happen when we click on the button is for the button animation to play. So this action is going to be performed on the button object itself. So I'm going to drag and drop the cylinder into this slot here. And the event that I want to happen, I'm just going to resize the window here of the Unity editor. So for the no function, I'm going to be accessing here the animator component, and then this very long list appears, and unfortunately I cannot fit this in the recording window, but if you scroll down in this list, you will see that there is a set trigger option. There are two versions. One is int and one is string. So set trigger int or set trigger string. I'm going to select set trigger string. So I choose set trigger string here. And if I select this button and I go back to the animator graph, we have to put into here the name of the trigger or the control switch that we want to activate. So if I go back to the animator, you can see I named the control switch push button, and that will activate the button push animation. So I'm going to switch back to the scene tab here, and in the object inspector I'm going to type the name in here, which is push button, press enter on the keyboard. So in other words, when we click on this button, we're going to activate the push button control switch for this cylinder. But I also want to activate the animation for the door as well. So I'm going to click on this plus icon, and this time we want to perform a second action, and this one is going to happen on the door hinge. So I'm going to drag and drop the door hinge here, and once again for the function I'm going to choose animator, and I'm going to choose set trigger string. So we have set trigger string, and now for this door hinge the trigger is called open door. We can see that in the animator here. So I'm going to go back to the cylinder and the scene tab. I'm going to scroll down here in the object inspector, and so the second one we want to activate is open door. I'm going to press enter on the keyboard. I'm going to resize the window here so that it fills the recording window. I'm going to switch over to the game tab and then press play on the toolbar. And now when I run over, actually let me just maximize the game tab here. I'm going to press play on the toolbar. So now when we run over here and we click on the button push animation will play along with the door animation. So let's just click on that. And there we are. We now have a button push and a door open, and we have successfully configured this level with animation. So there's a lot of work there, but we've managed to achieve quite a lot. We've played two animations, we've created level interactivity, and now it's time to move on. Now in this second stretch of the animation module, what I want to demonstrate here is character animation using the Mechanim system. Now, character animation and Mecanim generally are worthy of a complete course, so I simply cannot show you everything that there is to see, but I'm going to show you the basics of getting an animated character up and running in Mecanim using the standard assets that are provided with Unity here. So in the next part, what I'm going to be doing is basically taking a look at how we can configure this scene that you see here in front of you. So what we have is a basic scene in which we have this ground plane. We have this character here that is part of the characters package. So you can import the assets using the asset packages by choosing assets import package. And I have imported the characters package as well as the prototyping package. And you can find this project in the course companion files in the char anim folder. So we have this character here standing on a ground plane, and I have configured an animation controller for him so that when we press play on the toolbar and we press the forwards key on the keyboard, the character will change from this standing idle state, and he will change smoothly into a running state and move forwards in the scene. And this is dependent almost entirely on animation data. So I'm going to be showing you how you can configure this basic scene using Mecanim, and we'll get started next. So I'm here in Unity with an empty scene. Well, an empty scene except for the directional light, the main camera, and this floor mesh which is generated from the prototyping assets that are included with Unity. And what I'm going to be doing is adding an animated character to the scene. The character I'm going to be using is included in the character controller assets that are provided with Unity. You can import the character by choosing Assets, Import Package, Add Characters. You can find the character model here in the Standard Assets folder, Characters, Third Person, and then inside the Models folder, you will find the Ethan character. Now, of course, you're not limited to just this character on its own. You can import pretty much any kind of animated character into Unity. On the Model tab, you will find that not really very much is different from any other kind of mesh. And in the Preview panel, you can see the character mesh that has been imported here. But if we switch to the Rig tab, you will find that the animation type for character models is set to humanoid. That means that this mesh file contains not just the character mesh itself, but also contains rigging data, that is bone information inside this character model that helps it deform and animate properly. This bone data is generated inside the 3D modeling software where you make your character model and you import it into Unity. Next to the configure button here, you will see a check mark, which means that Unity has successfully detected the rigging data in the file. And if I click on the configure button, Unity will display this character editor mode, and this displays the rigging information that is provided inside the character file. So we have the character mesh, and then overlaid on top of that is a display of the bone information in the file, and the character model here in the hierarchy panel displays the complete hierarchy of the bones in the model. The idea of this editor is to get all the bones to display properly in green so that they map nicely onto this character map here. This is the avatar editor, and the idea is to map the bones in your model to this character map here. And when you do that, Unity will let you easily reuse animations across many different models because all the models share the same bone mapping data. So for example, if I have a look at the map down here, you can see that the chest bone, if I click on that, it will select the chest bone in the hierarchy. And the same if I scroll down further and I choose, for example, the shoulder and click on that, it will select the shoulder bone in the hierarchy. If you happen to find a bone that is incorrectly mapped and is not in the right place, typically it will display in red. But if it doesn't and you want to change the mapping, all you have to do is drag and drop the bone from the hierarchy here into the appropriate slot to build up the correct mapping to make sure that all the right bones map to the right places. But this character model is absolutely fine. So I'm just going to leave it exactly how it is and press on the button that says Done. So this character model is completely configured. If I move over to the Animations tab, you will find that the Import Animation checkmark here is not ticked. This might seem strange because if we want to use an animated character, it seems that we should be importing animation data, but in Unity you don't have to import the animation data from the same mesh file. You can include your character meshes separately and then save out the animation data in separate files and reuse the animation data across many different character models. So this character model has no animation data imported. It is able to read animation data from other files and reuse those. So I'm just going to drag and drop the character model onto the floor in the scene, and that's looking good. This is almost ready to get started here. So now we've added the character to the scene. Next, we're going to get started at animating him. Now I want to create an animation controller that will animate the character model that we have in our scene. And before I get started at doing that, I want to take a look at some of the animation data that is included in the character controller assets that we've imported into Unity. Previously we saw the character model in the models folder, but you'll notice that we also have an animation folder here, and if I double click on that, we can see a variety of different animations that have been imported. These files don't actually contain any meshes at all. They simply contain animation data, but we do have the ability to preview that animation data. For example, if I select this model here and I move to the Animations tab, you can see in the preview window that we are previewing different animations. So I can press the play button on the toolbar to see the animation that's being played. I can select, for example, this animation, which is in the file, and press play, and again preview that animation. I can select this one, for example, press play, and preview that animation. And the same thing happens for these other files. So we have this idle animation, which is what the character is doing when he's just standing there idle. We have some other ones here. For example, I have this walk animation, which I'm going to be using. So here you can see the character walking. Now, ultimately, what I want to happen is when the player presses the up key on the keyboard, the character is going to transition from standing idle to moving forwards. So I'm going to be building an animation controller that will allow the player to do this. We've seen animation controllers before. We've used them previously to control the push button animation and the open door animation. And now I'm going to be using them to control the character animation. So let's get started at doing that. I'm going to move up here to the Assets folder, and I'm going to right click in the project panel and choose Create, and then select Animator Controller like so. And I'm going to call this Anim Char Control and press Enter on the keyboard. Again, the name of this asset is not critical. It's for your reference only. I'm then going to select the character in the scene here, and you will see that automatically he has an animator component. I'm just going to drag and drop the controller into the controller slot. That will assign this controller to this character. I'm going to view this controller inside the animator editor by double clicking on it. As before, you can also display the animator editor by choosing Window and then choosing Animator to display that editor. And we are presented here with this completely empty graph. And to control the animation for this character, I'm going to be using a blend tree, which is a special thing, a special node that I can add to the animator, and it will blend smoothly between different animation states so that the character can be standing idle, and then the character will transition smoothly between the idle to the walk animation, and then between the walk animation to the run animation. We're going to be using a blend tree to blend between those different states. So I'm going to create a completely new blend tree here in the animator graph by right clicking and choosing Create State, and then choose From New Blend Tree, and this will add a blend tree to the graph. I'm going to give this the name as Char Blend Tree and press Enter on the keyboard. What I can do once the char blend is created, notice that this is highlighted in orange, meaning that it is the default state, that when the level begins, it will enter this blend tree, and I'm absolutely fine with that. But this blend tree contains a lot more information than is visible at first sight. What I can do is double click on the blend tree, and then it gives me more information. It gives me this controller at the center here, and we're going to be looking at how this works next. Now, effectively, what we want to do is to define 3 possible animation states for the character, and they are going to be idle, walk, and run. And we're going to have control over which one the character is in. We will not only have control over whether the character is idling, walking, or running, but we will be able to blend between the states so that we can be halfway in one state and halfway in another. So to get started with that, I'm going to select the blend tree here, and over here in the Object Inspector, under the Motion section, we have the ability to add the states that we need for our character. In particular, we want the 3 states, idle, walk, and run. So I'm going to press the plus icon 3 times, one, and add a motion field, click again, add motion field, and click again and choose add motion field. So we're added 3 motion fields, 1, 2, and 3. And we need to add animation data into each motion field. So in the project panel down here, I'm going to find the animation data that we're going to be using. So I'm going to select the animation folder. And if I select, for example, this animation state here, you'll see that this is humanoid idle. So I'm going to expand that. And here you'll see with this play icon, this represents the animation data itself. I can in fact preview that here in the Object Inspector. I'm just going to go back and select the blend tree and click and drag the idle state into the first motion field so that we have this one here, humanoid idle. And I'm going to just reduce that. The next state that I'm interested in is the humanoid walk. And I believe the humanoid walk is this one. Yes. So it says humanoid walk.fbx. And again, I can expand that and select the walk state and press play to preview that. And you can see that the character is walking. So I'm going to pause that. I'm going to select the blend tree again. And for the second motion field, I'm going to drag and drop the walk state, like so. And finally, I'm going to find the character run state. I'm going to select this model here, and notice this is humanoid run.fbx. And if I expand that and select the run animation, again, I can preview that and see the character running here. So I'm going to pause that, select the blend tree again, and drag and drop the run state into the third motion field. So if I have a look at this in the animator graph here, you can see we have the idle animation, the walk animation, and the run animation. I'm just going to select the blend tree again. Now I want to have control over how the blending takes place across these different motions. You can see that if this automate threshold is enabled, notice that we have these threshold values next to the animation. So what's going to happen is when we are using the value of 0, we're going to be playing the idle animation. The value of 0.5 corresponds to walking, and the value of 1 corresponds to running. So I'm going to be mapping these numerical values to a parameter that we have seen before. So in the parameters section, I'm going to click on the plus icon, and from here I'm going to choose the float field. This allows us to select a floating point number, that is a decimal number. I'm going to name this field move forwards, like so. And notice that this has a numerical value. Over here on the Object Inspector, where it says parameter, I'm going to click on the drop down and change this to move forwards, which matches the name of this. And notice move forwards now appears in here as well at the blend tree. If I press play on the toolbar, we can preview how this is going to work. So I'm going to press play, and you will see that the character is idling here in the preview panel. And this is simply because the move forwards parameter is specified as 0, and according to the thresholds, 0 means idle. But if I begin to increase this value here using the slider to a different value, you can see the character is starting to move forwards very slowly. That's because the value is 0.23, So we are partially between idle and walk. We are closer to idle than walk, so the character is moving slowly. I can then increase this even further to again push the state into a walk. And again, I can start to move even further towards the value of 1, at which point the character is running. So I'm blending the character between 0 and 1, which represents the different animation states. And notice in this preview window how the different states are blended between smoothly. So this mainly configures the blend tree for the character here. I'm just going to pause that. I can easily go back to the standard animation graph just by clicking on the base layer here. So if I need to go back to the blend tree, I can just double click on the blend tree and it takes us to the blend tree. I can go back to the base layer just by clicking on this base layer, and we go back to the main animation data here. So that is the animation controller now configured for the character. In the level, I want to have control over this move forwards data that will allow the character to transition from an idle state to a run state, and we'll see how to do that next. Now in this final stretch of the course, what I want to do is show you how we can control the animation controller using the keyboard controls so that we can make this character change from an idle state to motion walking forwards in this level. Now to do this, I have to use a script file. Scripting is beyond the scope of this course, but I want to show you the script file that is involved. It is this char mover script, and I can drag and drop that onto the character. So I'm just going to drag and drop that onto the character and select the character. And all I have to do is specify the move speed of the character. So I'm going to change this to, let's say, 50, for example. And I'm just going to show you how the script works. I'm just going to bring in MonoDevelop, which is a scripting program that comes with Unity. So what happens is, in this update function, I use the input.getAxis function to read which keys on the keyboard the player is pressing. The vertical axis represents the up and down keys. So if the player is pressing the up key, then we are going to be communicating with the animation controller, and we are going to be communicating with the move forwards parameter. And if I go back to the animator window, you will see that I named this parameter here move forwards, because this is what drives the blend tree between the animation states. So I'm going to switch back to the scene tab here and bring back MonoDevelop. So I'm using the setFloat function to control the move forwards parameter, and I'm going to be moving forwards by my speed. That ultimately is all this script is doing. So I'm going to move MonoDevelop out of the way, and I've dragged and dropped the mover script onto this character, and we can see that because we now have the char mover script attached to this character as a component. So all I have to do now is press play on the keyboard, and the character straight away is in an idle state. That is the idle state of the blend tree, and all I have to do now is press the forwards key on the keyboard, and suddenly the character springs into motion. If I release the forwards key, the character stops and transitions back into the idle state because of the blend tree. I can see this going on by just selecting the character. I'm going to drag and drop the animator beside the game tab so that I can see the animator working away at the same time. So I'm just going to change the size of some of these panels here so I can see this going on. If I press play now, you can see that the blend tree is working away. I'm going to double click to access the blend tree. And again, you can see that this move forwards parameter is going to be set as I play the game. You can see now we're transitioning to pretty much 0.8 there, which is close enough to the run state. And when I release my mouse, we return back to 0. So that causes the character to move. One thing I want to mention about this character here is that when I press the up key, the character runs forward. That is, it runs forward in the level. It doesn't remain in place, it actually runs forward. That is because this character is configured to use what is known as root motion. If I select the character in the level and I have a look at the object inspector, you will see that there is a setting here that says apply root motion. That is enabled. That means that when I press the up key, the character will not only run, his legs will not only move, but the character will change his position in the scene. If I didn't want him to do that, if I just wanted him to play the run animation so that I could have independent control over his position, what I should do is remove the tick here from the Apply Root Motion field. Now when I press play and press the up key, you'll notice that the character does play the run animation, but his position in the level no longer changes. So that is what the Apply Root Motion does. It simply deactivates the root motion in the animation data. So that completes this introduction to the animation part of Unity, as well as the introduction to Unity 5 generally. I hope you found it very helpful. This has been 3dmotive.com and I'm Alan Thorne. And until next time, happy Unity development.